angry Chinese billionaire was leaving until the janitor's 7-year-old daughter surprised him in Mandarin and shocked everyone by convincing the Chinese billionaire. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Richard Chen's Italian leather shoes struck the marble floor like thunder as he stormed through the lobby of Morrison Industries. His face was a mask of controlled fury, the kind that had made grown executives tremble in boardrooms across 3 continents. The deal was off. 27 months of negotiations, countless flights between Shanghai and Chicago, and it all crumbled because of one man's greed. "Mr. Chen, please," called James Morrison from behind, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "We can still work this out." Richard didn't slow down. At 62, he'd built his empire by knowing when to walk away, and this was one of those moments. His black Maybach waited outside, engine running, ready to take him to O'Hare Airport and back to China, where his billions couldn't be insulted by small-minded American businessmen. As he pushed through the revolving door, a small voice cut through his rage like a knife through silk. "Wait, sir!" The words were spoken in perfect Mandarin, with the innocent clarity that only comes from a child. Richard froze. He turned slowly, expecting to see one of Morrison's assistants with their broken attempts at his native language. Instead, he found himself staring down at a little girl, no more than 7 years old, with sandy brown hair pulled back in pigtails and enormous green eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. She wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days and clutched a worn stuffed rabbit against her chest. "You look very sad," she said softly in flawless Mandarin. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. This child, this American child, spoke his mother tongue with the same gentle cadence his own daughter had used, before the accident, before everything fell apart, before he'd built walls around his heart that no one had been able to penetrate for 15 years. Who are you?" he whispered in English, his voice barely audible. The girl smiled, and for a moment the busy Chicago street seemed to fade away. "I'm Emma. My daddy cleans this building. He says you're the important man from China who makes everyone nervous." Richard glanced up and saw a man in his 30s approaching, tall, lean, wearing a janitor's uniform with apologetic eyes. This had to be the father. "Emma, honey, you can't just—" The man started, then stopped when he saw Richard's expression. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Chen. She doesn't understand about business meetings." But Richard couldn't take his eyes off the child. "Where did you learn Mandarin?" Emma's smile grew wider. "Mama taught me before she went to heaven. She said it was the most beautiful language in the world, and that someday I'd meet someone who needed to remember that beauty exists." The words struck something deep inside Richard's chest, something he'd thought was dead and buried. His hand trembled slightly as he loosened his tie. "What did you just say?" But before Emma could answer, her father was gently pulling her away, mumbling more apologies. As they disappeared into the building, Emma turned back one last time. "See you tomorrow, sir," she said in perfect Mandarin. Richard stood frozen on the sidewalk, his driver waiting patiently by the open car door, while one question echoed in his mind. How could this child possibly know he'd be back tomorrow when he himself had just decided he was leaving forever? Richard Chen stared at the ceiling of his penthouse suite at the Four Seasons, sleep eluding him for the 3rd consecutive hour. The city lights of Chicago painted shifting patterns across the walls, but all he could see were those enormous green eyes and hear that small voice speaking his native language with impossible perfection. Every time he closed his eyes, the memory played on repeat. The way she tilted her head, the gentle cadence of her words, the strange familiarity in her smile. By 4 a.m., he'd given up entirely on sleep. Richard had built a billion-dollar empire by trusting his instincts and right now every instinct screamed that this child was somehow connected to something larger than coincidence. His assistant Jennifer was shocked when he called at dawn. "Mr. Chen, I thought you were flying back to Shanghai today. The board meeting is scheduled for Thursday, and you specifically said—" "Change of plans," Richard interrupted, surprising himself with his own words. "Cancel the flight. Clear my schedule for the week. I'm staying in Chicago." "But, sir, the Guangzhou project proposal—" "We'll wait." Richard's tone brooked no argument. "Send my apologies to the board. Tell them something urgent has come up." Jennifer's confusion was palpable through the phone. In 15 years of working for Richard Chen, she'd never known him to deviate from a business plan. "Should I reschedule the Morrison Industries meeting as well?" Richard paused, staring out at the awakening city. "No. I'll handle Morrison personally." By 8 a.m., he was back at Morrison Industries, though he couldn't quite explain why to himself. He told his driver to wait, knowing this visit might be brief. The marble lobby looked different in the morning light, less imposing, more welcoming somehow. "Mr. Chen!" James Morrison practically sprinted across the marble floor, his expensive Italian shoes clicking frantically. "I knew you'd reconsider. The terms we discussed yesterday, I've been thinking all night, and I believe we can find a middle ground that works for both our companies." "The terms are still unacceptable." Richard cut him off, his eyes scanning the lobby. "I'm here for other reasons." Morrison's face fell, but before he could respond, Richard saw her. Emma sat in a corner near the elevator bank, cross-legged on the floor, with a worn coloring book spread before her. Her father pushed a maintenance cart nearby, occasionally glancing over at his daughter with the protective love that only a single parent understands. She looked up as if she'd sensed his presence, and that radiant smile bloomed across her face like sunrise. "You came back," she said in perfect Mandarin, jumping up from her spot and leaving her crayons scattered. Richard found himself walking toward her, ignoring Morrison's confused protests behind him. Each step felt like destiny pulling him forward. "How did you know I would?" Emma tilted her head, considering the question with the seriousness of a scholar contemplating the universe's greatest mysteries. Her small hands clasped behind her back, and for a moment she looked exactly like his own daughter had when deep in thought. "Mama always said that broken hearts recognize each other across any distance," Emma said finally. "Yours looked just like mine did when she first got really sick. Daddy tries to hide his sadness, but I can see it too. Broken people find each other because they understand the same kind of hurt." The words hit Richard like a physical blow, each syllable finding its way past defenses he'd spent 15 years constructing. This child, this impossibly wise child, had seen through his carefully maintained facade in a single glance. Tom Williams approached nervously, his janitor's uniform impeccably clean despite the early hour. Up close, Richard could see intelligence in the man's eyes, the kind that spoke of education and dreams deferred rather than abandoned. "Sir, I'm so sorry if she's bothering you again. Emma, sweetheart, come on, let's let Mr. Chen get back to his important business." But Richard held up a hand, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "She's not bothering me at all." He knelt down to Emma's level, something he hadn't done since his own daughter was small. The movement felt foreign yet familiar, like muscle memory awakening from a long sleep. "Tell me about your mother," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma's eyes lit up with the pure joy that only comes from a child being invited to share something infinitely precious. She clasped her hands together, practically vibrating with excitement. "Mama was the most beautiful person in the whole world," Emma began, her voice taking on the reverent tone children use when speaking of their greatest treasures. She knew how to say, "I love you," in 7 different languages, and she taught me that words carry magic when they come from the heart. Richard felt something crack inside his chest as Emma continued, but the haunting question remained. What could a janitor's wife possibly have known about China that would enable her to teach her daughter such flawless, nuanced Mandarin? 20 minutes later, Emma had successfully convinced both her father and Richard to follow her to a small break room on the second floor. She moved through the building like she owned it, greeting security guards and maintenance staff by name, her presence bringing smiles to faces that probably didn't smile often enough. "This is my homework station," Emma announced proudly, gesturing to a folding table she'd set up in the corner. The surface was covered with coloring books, a pencil case shaped like a panda, and a worn photograph in a tarnished silver frame. "This is Mama," Emma said, lifting the photo with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. The woman in the photograph was indeed beautiful, with kind eyes that seemed to hold secrets and long black hair that caught sunlight like silk. But it was the background that made Richard's breath catch in his throat. Traditional Chinese architecture, the distinctive red walls and golden roof tiles that could only be found in Beijing's historic Forbidden City district. "Where was this taken?" Richard asked, his voice barely steady. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted the frame from Emma's small fingers. "Beijing," Emma replied matter-of-factly as if discussing the weather. "Mama lived there for 5 whole years. She taught English at a big university with lots of smart students." Emma's small finger traced her mother's face in the photo with infinite tenderness. "She always said China gave her the most precious gift of her life, but she never told me what it was. She said I'd understand when I was older." Tom appeared in the doorway, lunchbox in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. Up close, Richard could see the exhaustion etched into every line of the man's face, the worn edges of someone working multiple jobs just to keep his head above water. But there was dignity there too, and love so fierce it was almost tangible. "Mr. Chen, you really don't need to spend your time listening to Emma's stories. I'm sure you have important meetings." "Please," Richard interrupted, gesturing to a plastic chair. "Sit, I have nowhere more important to be." For the next hour, Richard learned about Tom Williams, a man who'd graduated magna cum laude from Northwestern with a degree in aerospace engineering, who'd designed components for satellites and military aircraft until budget cuts decimated his department 3 years ago. Since then, he'd been cleaning office buildings at night and driving for a rideshare company during the day, all while raising Emma alone and trying to keep his dreams of returning to engineering alive. "Sarah, my wife, she got sick when Emma was 4, Tom explained, his voice thick with emotion that time hadn't dimmed. "Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4 by the time they caught it. The medical bills. Well, that's why I'm here mopping floors instead of designing aircraft that touch the stars." Emma climbed onto her father's lap, sensing his sadness with the intuitive wisdom children possess. She wrapped her small arms around his neck and whispered something in his ear that made him smile despite the pain in his eyes. "But Mama said every ending is just a new beginning waiting to happen," Emma announced to Richard, her voice carrying absolute conviction. "She said sometimes we have to lose everything we think we want to find everything we actually need. Right, Daddy?" Tom kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. "That's right, sweetheart. Mama was always the smartest person in any room." Richard watched this display of love and loss, feeling something fundamental crack inside his chest. The devotion between father and daughter was so pure, so unguarded, that it made his own carefully controlled existence seem hollow by comparison. But one question burned in his mind with increasing urgency. If Emma's mother had spent 5 years in Beijing working at a university, there had to be records, colleagues, people who remembered her. And Richard Chen knew people in Beijing who could find anyone, trace any connection, uncover any secret. What he was about to discover about Sarah Williams would shatter every assumption he'd made about coincidence, fate, and the invisible threads that bind human hearts across continents and decades. The next morning, Richard arrived at Morrison Industries carrying shopping bags from the city's finest art supply store. He'd spent the previous evening on international calls, his Beijing contacts already digging into university records from 5 years ago. But today, his focus was entirely on the small girl he found sitting in her usual corner, though something was different. Emma's coloring book lay untouched beside her, and her usually bright eyes were red-rimmed with tears. "What's wrong, little one?" Richard asked in Mandarin, kneeling beside her on the cold marble floor. The endearment came naturally, though he hadn't used it since his own daughter was alive. Emma looked up with tear-filled eyes that seemed far too old for her 7-year-old face. Today would have been Mama's birthday. She would have been 34. Her voice cracked on the number. "Daddy's trying to be brave for me, but I heard him crying in the bathroom this morning. He thinks I don't know, but I always know when he's sad." Richard's heart clenched painfully. The raw grief in her voice transported him back to his own darkest days when breathing felt like betrayal and every sunrise seemed like a cruel joke. Without thinking, he reached into his shopping bags and began pulling out supplies: professional watercolors, sable brushes, premium paper that felt like silk beneath fingers. "Your mother taught you Mandarin because she loved beautiful things," Richard said, his voice gentle as he helped Emma set up the art supplies on her small table. "Today, we'll create something beautiful for her, something that carries your love across whatever distance separates you." Emma's eyes widened in wonder as she touched the expensive brushes with reverent fingers. "These are so fancy. Are you sure it's okay to use them?" "Beautiful things should be used to create more beauty," Richard said, paraphrasing something his own wife had once told him. "What was your mother's favorite place in Beijing?" Emma's face brightened as she dipped a brush in water, her movements becoming more confident. "Mama loved this garden where old people practiced Tai Chi every morning. She said watching them was like seeing poetry written in the air." She began painting with surprising skill, her small hands creating delicate strokes on the paper. The cherry blossoms made her feel like she was living inside a fairy tale. Richard's brush froze mid-stroke. Zhongshan Park. It had to be Zhongshan Park, where his wife Lin had practiced Tai Chi every morning for 3 years before she died. It was Lin's sanctuary, her place of peace after their daughter's accident, where she'd befriended countless foreigners who came to watch the ancient morning rituals. "Emma," Richard said carefully, trying to keep his voice steady, "do you know if your mother had any special friends in that garden? Anyone she talked about particularly?" Emma nodded enthusiastically, adding pink blossoms to her painting with careful precision. "She had this one friend who became like a grandmother to her. An older Chinese lady who taught her about inner peace and finding joy even when your heart is broken." Emma paused, brush poised in mid-air. "Mama said this lady had lost her daughter and husband, but she still found reasons to smile every day." The world tilted sideways. Richard gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. "Emma," he whispered, "do you know what your mother's Chinese name was? Did this lady give her a special name?" Emma's face lit up with pride. "Oh yes, the old lady gave her a beautiful name. She called her Mei Xin, beautiful heart. Mama said it was the greatest honor anyone had ever given her." The brush fell from Richard's trembling hand, clattering to the floor and leaving a splash of blue paint on the white marble. Mei Xin. Lin had spoken about Mei Xin constantly during her final years, the young American teacher who had brought light into her darkest days, who had listened to her grief over losing their daughter, who had somehow helped her find hope again, even while facing her own terminal diagnosis. Sarah Williams wasn't just any American who'd lived in Beijing. She was the angel who'd saved his wife's spirit in those final years, the beacon of hope who'd helped Lynn face death with grace and acceptance. And now her daughter was here, speaking the language Lynn had lovingly taught her, carrying forward a connection that defied every law of probability. Richard stared at Emma's painting, cherry blossoms surrounding two figures practicing Tai Chi in perfect harmony, and realized that this meeting was no accident. Lynn had spoken of Mei Xin's unborn child during her final weeks, blessing the baby who would grow up without ever knowing the woman who'd prayed for her future happiness. This was Lynn's final gift to him, reaching across death itself to heal his broken heart through the daughter of the woman who'd healed hers. Richard spent the entire weekend in his hotel suite, pacing like a caged animal, while his phone buzzed constantly with updates from Beijing. His contact at Beijing University had been thorough. Personnel records, faculty photographs, even security footage from the campus where Sarah Williams had taught English literature for 5 transformative years. The evidence was overwhelming. Sarah Williams, known to her Chinese friends as Mei Xin, had indeed become the closest companion to his wife Lynn during Lynn's battle with cancer. But the details his investigators uncovered made Richard's hands shake as he read email after email. Sarah hadn't just been a friend to Lynn, she'd been her lifeline. The reports described how the young American teacher had spent countless hours at Lynn's bedside during chemotherapy sessions, how she'd learned to prepare traditional Chinese comfort foods, how she'd even convinced the hospital staff to allow Lynn's favorite Tai Chi instructor to visit during her final weeks. Most incredibly, Sarah had been there the day Lynn died, holding her hand and singing Chinese lullabies she'd learned specifically for that moment. According to the hospital chaplain's notes, Sarah had promised Lynn that she would carry forward her love and wisdom, ensuring that Lynn's spirit would touch future generations through acts of unexpected kindness. On Monday morning, Richard arrived at Morrison Industries with a heavy heart and a manila envelope containing photographs his Beijing contact had express-mailed over the weekend. His hands trembled as he entered the building, knowing that what he was about to share would change everything for the Williams family. He found Emma in the break room, carefully arranging crayons by color while her father organized cleaning supplies in methodical rows. The domesticity of the scene, father and daughter working together in quiet harmony, reminded Richard painfully of his own lost family. "Mr. Chen!" Emma ran to him with her usual enthusiasm, her face lighting up like Christmas morning. "Look, Daddy brought Mama's journal from home. I asked him special because I wanted to show you her drawings." Tom looked embarrassed, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. She insisted on bringing it. "Sarah used to write in it every single day when she was in Beijing. Honestly, I probably should have put it away years ago, but Emma finds so much comfort in it." Richard's heart pounded against his ribs as Emma opened the worn leather journal with reverent care. The pages were filled with Sarah's neat handwriting, observations about Chinese culture, lesson plans for her students, daily reflections on life in a foreign country. But what made Richard's vision blur were the sketches scattered throughout every page, detailed drawings of Beijing landmarks, portraits of her students, and frequent illustrations of elderly Chinese women practicing Tai Chi in various parks. "Mama drew everyone she loved," Emma explained, turning pages with the careful precision of a librarian handling ancient manuscripts. She said drawing helped her remember all the good times, even when she was far away from the people who made her happy. Richard's breath caught as Emma turned to a page dated just 3 months before Lynn's death. There, rendered in loving detail, was an unmistakable portrait of his wife, sitting by a hospital window. Lynn looked frail but peaceful, her face turned towards sunlight streaming through glass. Below the drawing, Sarah had written in flowing script, My dearest friend Lynn told me today about her husband Richard and her daughter Lily, and how much love still lives in her heart despite losing them both. She made me promise that if I ever met Richard, I would tell him that love doesn't end with death. It just changes form and finds new ways to express itself. She believes their paths will cross again when the time is right, when healing can finally begin. Richard's eyes filled with tears as he read the words, each sentence hitting him like a physical blow. Lynn had known. Somehow, his intuitive, spiritual wife had known that her American friend would one day be the bridge that led him back to the land of the living. But as Emma turned another page, Richard saw something that stopped his heart completely. A business card was carefully taped to the journal page. His own business card from 15 years ago, creased and faded, but still legible. Beside it, in Lynn's unmistakable handwriting, was a note. For my dear Mei Xin, when you or your family need help in America, find this man. He has a good heart hidden under all that pain. Tell him Lin Chen sent you and that love finds a way to honor its promises. Emma looked up at him with those knowing green eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. Mama said someone would come to help us when we needed it most. She said he'd have kind eyes hiding behind a sad face, and that he'd understand what it means to love someone you can't hold anymore. Richard realized with crystal clarity that this wasn't chance at all. Lynn had orchestrated this entire meeting from beyond the grave, ensuring that Sarah's daughter would find him precisely when the Williams family needed help most desperately. But what Lynn couldn't have possibly known was how much he would need Emma's healing presence in return, how this little girl's wisdom would become the key to unlocking 15 years of carefully guarded grief. The web of connection was so intricate, so perfectly timed, that Richard finally understood what Lynn had always tried to tell him. Love doesn't recognize the boundaries between life and death, and healing often comes from the most unexpected sources. Richard could barely sleep that night, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. He'd made decisions that would change multiple lives, and the weight of responsibility felt both terrifying and exhilarating. The next morning, he arrived at Morrison Industries carrying 2 items that would alter the Williams family's trajectory forever. A bank draft that represented more money than Tom had seen in his lifetime, and his phone loaded with contact information for Beijing University's current administration. He found Emma and Tom in the main lobby, but the scene was different from usual. Tom sat heavily in one of the leather chairs, his shoulders slumped in defeat, while Emma tried unsuccessfully to cheer him up by showing him her latest drawings. "Daddy lost his other job yesterday," Emma whispered sadly as Richard approached. "The car company said they don't need drivers anymore because they bought robots instead. But I told him not to worry because Mama always said angels come when you need them most." Tom looked up with red-rimmed eyes, embarrassment and desperation warring across his features. "I'm sorry, Mr. Chen. I know Emma shouldn't be bothering you with our problems. It's just been a difficult week and—" "Tom," Richard interrupted gently, sitting down across from them. "Your wife, Sarah, was my wife's best friend in Beijing. They weren't just casual acquaintances. They were as close as sisters." Tom's head snapped up, confusion replacing despair. "What? That's impossible. Sarah never mentioned knowing anyone named Chen. She talked about her Chinese friends, but—" Richard pulled out his phone and began showing them photographs his Beijing contact had sent overnight, dozens of images showing Sarah and Lynn together in various locations around the city. There were pictures of them sharing meals in traditional restaurants, practicing calligraphy together, and most poignantly, sitting side by side in hospital waiting rooms during Lynn's treatment. "This is impossible," Tom breathed, staring at the photos with growing amazement. "Sarah never said. I mean, she mentioned having close friends in Beijing, but she never told me about someone whose husband was a businessman who could help your family," Richard finished quietly, "because she didn't know at the time that she might need help. But my wife Lynn knew. She always seemed to see connections that others missed. He handed Emma her mother's journal, which he'd borrowed overnight with Tom's permission. "Look at the very last page, sweetheart." Emma turned to the final entry with trembling fingers. The page was dated just 1 week before Sarah's death, and her handwriting was noticeably weaker, but the words were clear. "My darling Emma, if you're reading this, then the cancer has won its battle, but love never loses the war. Remember everything Mama Lynn taught me about finding beauty in sorrow and strength in connection. Look for the man with kind eyes and a sad face, the one Lynn told me about so many times. He will come when you need him most, and you will heal his heart just as his dear wife healed mine. Love finds a way, sweetheart. It always finds a way, even across oceans and years and the space between earth and heaven." Below the entry, taped carefully to the page, was a photograph Richard had never seen before. Lynn and Sarah together on Sarah's last day in Beijing, both women glowing with happiness as they placed their hands on Sarah's barely visible pregnant belly. On the back, in Lynn's handwriting, "Blessing this precious child with love that will span continents and generations." "Lynn blessed you before you were even born," Richard whispered to Emma, tears streaming down his face without shame. "She prayed that you would grow up surrounded by love, that you would have your mother's generous heart, and that someday you would help heal the world's broken spirits." Emma climbed into Richard's lap without hesitation, her small arms wrapping around his neck with the trust that only children possess. "So we're family now? Mama Lynn's family and Mama Sarah's family?" "Yes, little one," Richard said, his voice breaking with emotion, as 15 years of frozen grief finally began to thaw. "We're family now, and family takes care of each other." Tom stared at them both, overwhelmed by the impossible beauty of the moment. "I don't understand how this is possible. How did you find us? How did you know?" Richard looked up at him, still holding Emma close. "I didn't find you, Tom. Love found us. Your wife and my wife made sure of that, even after death tried to separate us all." As he held Emma and watched Tom's face transform from despair to wonder, Richard realized that Lynn's plan was even more beautiful and complex than he'd initially understood. She hadn't just arranged for him to help the Williams family financially. She'd ensured that the love and wisdom Sarah had given her would live on through Emma, creating an unbreakable chain of healing that would ripple through generations yet unborn. The orphaned billionaire, the struggling father, and the wise little girl were now bound together by something stronger than coincidence. They were connected by love that refused to recognize the boundaries between life and death, between past and future, between broken hearts and the healing they so desperately needed. The conference call with Shanghai was brutal. Richard sat in his hotel suite at 3 a.m. Chicago time, watching his board of directors' faces fill his laptop screen, their expressions ranging from concern to openly hostile. The bank draft he'd written to Tom Williams represented more money than most families saw in several lifetimes, and his board wanted explanations he wasn't prepared to give. "Richard, this is completely unprecedented," said Margaret Jo, his longest-serving board member and former law partner. $50 million to a janitor? Our shareholders will demand answers. The Chinese financial press is already asking questions. "My personal finances are not subject to board approval," Richard replied coldly, though he could feel his carefully constructed business persona beginning to crack. For 15 years, he'd been the ice-cold CEO who never made emotional decisions. Now he was writing checks based on the words of a 7-year-old girl. "But your judgment affects our company's stability," pressed David Liu, the board's youngest member and biggest skeptic. "This Williams family, what's your connection to them? Is this some kind of blackmail situation? Because if it is, enough." Richard's voice cut through the conference call like a blade. I said it's personal, and it remains personal. End of discussion. But after ending the call, Richard realized his problems were just beginning. His assistant Jennifer had already fielded 6 calls from financial journalists, and his company's stock price had dropped 2% on rumors of his erratic behavior. The business empire he'd built as armor against grief was now threatening to become a prison. The next morning he arrived at Morrison Industries to find Emma waiting in the lobby with a drawing in her hands. She'd sketched the 3 of them, Richard, Tom, and herself, standing in front of what looked like a house with a garden full of cherry blossoms. "I dreamed about this last night," Emma said, handing him the drawing. Mama Lynn was there too, and she was smiling. She said, "Family isn't about blood, it's about choosing to love people even when it's difficult." Richard studied the drawing, noting the careful detail Emma had put into each figure. In her sketch, he was smiling, something he hadn't done genuinely in years. But the happiness in the drawing felt fragile, like something that could shatter with the wrong word or decision. "Emma, what if helping your family means I have to give up things that are important to me?" Richard asked carefully. "What if other people don't understand why I want to help you?" Emma looked up at him with those wise green eyes that seemed to hold secrets beyond her years. "Mama Sarah used to say that doing the right thing is never easy, but it's always worth it. She said that when you love someone, you don't count the cost, you just love them." Tom appeared from the elevator bank, moving more slowly than usual. The relief of financial security should have made him lighter, but Richard could see the weight of obligation settling on the man's shoulders like a heavy coat. "Mr. Chen, I've been thinking all night," Tom said quietly. "This money you've given us, it's more than generous, but I need to understand what you expect in return. Nothing in life is free, especially not $50 million. Richard felt a stab of pain at Tom's wariness. "I expect nothing except that you use it to build a good life for Emma. Let her have the childhood her mother would have wanted, the education she deserves, the opportunities that poverty might have stolen from her." "But why?" Tom pressed. "I understand that our wives were friends, but this level of generosity, there has to be more to it." Richard looked down at Emma, who was watching their conversation with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. How could he explain that this little girl had accomplished what 15 years of therapy, meditation, and business success had failed to do? How could he tell Tom that Emma's simple presence had given him permission to feel again? "Because," Richard said finally, "your daughter has given me something more valuable than money. She's given me hope that broken things can heal." But even as he spoke the words, Richard could hear his phone buzzing with urgent messages from Shanghai. His board wasn't going to let this go quietly, and he was beginning to realize that choosing love over logic might cost him everything he'd spent decades building. The question was, would Emma's healing presence be enough to sustain him through the battles ahead? That afternoon, Richard did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He took an unscheduled break from business to spend time with a child. He, Emma, and Tom sat in Millennium Park, watching families enjoy the unusually warm October day. Emma had insisted on bringing her art supplies, and she was currently working on a new drawing, while Tom dozed fitfully on the park bench beside them. "Tell me about your daughter," Emma said suddenly, not looking up from her sketchpad. "The one who went to heaven." Richard's breath caught. He'd mentioned Lily only once, in passing, but Emma had a way of remembering every important detail. "What makes you think I want to talk about her?" "Because you get the same look Daddy gets when he thinks about Mama," Emma replied matter-of-factly. "Like you're trying to hold on to something that keeps slipping away." Richard watched Emma's small hands move across the paper, creating what appeared to be 2 little girls playing together in a garden. Her name was Lily. She was 8 when she died, just a year older than you are now. "How did she go to heaven?" The question was asked with such innocent directness that Richard found himself answering without his usual defenses. Car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light while Lynn was picking Lily up from piano lessons. His voice cracked slightly. I was supposed to pick her up that day, but I had an important meeting. I chose business over my family, and they paid the price. Emma finally looked up from her drawing, her green eyes filled with compassion that seemed impossible for someone so young. Is that why you work all the time? Because you think it's a punishment? The insight hit Richard like a physical blow. This 7-year-old had just identified what countless therapists had failed to uncover, that his workaholic tendencies weren't ambition, but penance. Maybe, he admitted quietly. Emma set down her crayon and climbed into his lap with the easy affection of a child who decided he belonged to her family. Mama Sarah told me something before she died. She said that sometimes we think we're being punished, but really we're just lost. And when you're lost, you have to stop running and let someone who loves you help you find your way home. Richard wrapped his arms around Emma, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and feeling something fundamental shift inside his chest. And you think you can help me find my way home? I think Mama Lynn and Mama Sarah are helping both of us, Emma said solemnly. They're like guardian angels, except they use people instead of wings. Tom stirred beside them, opening his eyes to see Richard holding his daughter with tears streaming down his face. For a moment, Tom looked alarmed, but then he saw the peace in Richard's expression and relaxed. She has that effect on people, Tom said softly. Sarah used to say Emma was born with an old soul and a young heart, the perfect combination for healing the world's wounded spirits. Richard looked down at Emma's drawing and gasped. She'd sketched 2 little girls who looked remarkably similar, one clearly Emma herself, and another who could have been Lily at the same age. They were holding hands in a garden filled with cherry blossoms, while 2 women watched from a distance with smiles on their faces. How did you know what Lily looked like? Richard whispered. Emma shrugged with the casual wisdom that had become her trademark. Mama Lynn showed her to me in my dream last night. She said Lily was excited to have a little sister who could help take care of her daddy. The words hit Richard with the force of revelation. Emma wasn't just helping him heal from his losses, she was somehow completing the family that grief had torn apart. Through this impossible, beautiful child, Lily's spirit was reaching out to comfort the father who'd carried guilt for 15 years. But as Richard held Emma close and felt more peace than he'd experienced since the accident, his phone buzzed with an urgent message from Jennifer. The board had called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning, and there were rumors that they were considering a vote of no confidence. Richard realized that choosing to love again meant choosing to fight for that love, even if it cost him everything else. The emergency board meeting was even worse than Richard had anticipated. He sat at the head of the polished conference table in Chen Industries' Chicago office, facing 8 stern faces on the video screen and 2 board members who'd flown in overnight from various locations. The atmosphere was so tense, it felt like a tribunal. Richard, we've received disturbing reports about your recent behavior, began Margaret Jo, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd helped build the company from nothing. Cancelled meetings, missed conference calls, and this mysterious $50 million transfer that you refuse to explain. Our shareholders are nervous, and frankly, so are we. The Hong Kong expansion project has stalled because you're not returning calls, added David Liu, shuffling through papers with obvious frustration. The Guangzhou partnership is considering other options. You're jeopardizing deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Richard looked around the table at faces he'd known for years, people who'd stood by him through personal tragedies and professional triumphs. But their expressions held no warmth now, only cold business calculation. I understand your concerns, Richard said carefully, but I need you to trust my judgment. This is a temporary adjustment in priorities, not a permanent change in leadership style. Trust? Margaret's eyebrows rose sharply. Richard, you've been in Chicago for 2 weeks. You've spent more time in the last week with this janitor and his daughter than you have on company business. That's not a temporary adjustment. That's a complete personality change. Thomas Kim, the board's financial expert, leaned forward with obvious concern. Richard, we're worried about you. This behavior is so unlike the man who built this company. Are you having some kind of breakdown? Because if you are, we can get you help, but we can't let you destroy everything we've worked for. The words stung because they contained a grain of truth. Richard was changing, fundamentally and irreversibly. The cold, calculating businessman who'd built a billion-dollar empire was being replaced by someone who made decisions with his heart instead of his head. I'm not having a breakdown, Richard said quietly. I'm having a breakthrough. Call it whatever you want, snapped David Liu. But if you don't return to Shanghai within 48 hours and resume normal business operations, we'll have no choice but to call for a vote of no confidence. The company bylaws allow us to remove a CEO who's no longer acting in the shareholders' best interests. The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword. Richard had built this company as a monument to his ambition and a fortress against grief. Now his board was threatening to take it away because he'd chosen love over profit, healing over success. "And if I refuse?" Richard asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then you'll be removed as CEO, your stock options will be forfeit, and you'll lose controlling interest in the company," Margaret said sadly. "Richard, please, don't make us do this. Come home. Be the leader we need you to be." Richard thought about Emma's drawing, about Tom's gratitude, about the peace he'd felt for the first time in 15 years. Then he thought about losing the empire he'd spent decades building, becoming just another wealthy retiree with no purpose or power. "I need 24 hours to consider your ultimatum," Richard said finally. After the meeting ended, Richard sat alone in his office, staring out at the Chicago skyline, while his phone buzzed with increasingly urgent messages. His entire life's work was on the line, and the choice seemed impossible. Return to his old life of emotional emptiness but professional success, or fight for his newfound family and lose everything else. That evening, he found Emma and Tom in the Morrison Industries break room, sharing a dinner of sandwiches and fruit that Tom had packed in a cooler. The simple domesticity of the scene, father and daughter eating together after a long day, reminded Richard of everything he'd lost and everything he might be about to lose again. "You look sad again," Emma observed, patting the chair beside her. "Is it because of the mean people on your computer?" Richard sat down heavily, feeling the weight of impossible decisions. "Emma, what would you do if you had to choose between keeping something you'd worked for your whole life and keeping the people you love?" Emma considered the question with her usual seriousness, then smiled with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted what truly mattered. "That's easy," she said, reaching for his hand. "You choose love. Everything else you can build again. But love is the only thing that makes you feel alive." As Richard looked into her wise green eyes, he realized that a 7-year-old girl had just given him the answer to the most important question of his life. Richard couldn't sleep that night, Emma's words echoing in his mind as he paced his hotel suite. Choose love. Everything else you can build again. But as dawn approached, his phone rang with a call that would change everything he thought he knew about fate, coincidence, and the invisible threads connecting human lives. "Mr. Chen?" The voice belonged to Dr. Sarah Mitchell, administrator at Beijing University. "I apologize for the early hour, but you asked me to call if I found anything unusual about Sarah Williams's time here. Well, I've discovered something quite extraordinary." Richard's heart began to race. "What kind of something?" "I was going through our archived security footage from 2019, and I found recordings from the day of your wife's memorial service at the University Chapel. Sarah Williams attended, of course. But there's something else. She brought a child with her, a 3-year-old girl who fits the description of Emma." Richard's hand trembled as he gripped the phone. "That's impossible. Emma would have been too young to travel internationally, and besides, why would Sarah bring her to Lynn's memorial service?" "That's what puzzled me too, so I did some additional research. Mr. Chen, I don't think this was Sarah's first time in Beijing. I found immigration records showing she'd made multiple trips to China starting in 2016, always with a young child. The most significant visit was in early 2018, when she stayed for 6 months and enrolled the child in a local preschool." The room spun around Richard as the implications hit him. "Dr. Mitchell, I need you to check something else. Look for any medical records, any hospital visits during those stays. Specifically, look for anything involving cancer treatment or consultations." 20 minutes later, Dr. Mitchell called back with information that shattered every assumption Richard had made about the past 2 weeks. Mr. Chen, Sarah Williams, was receiving experimental cancer treatment at Beijing International Hospital starting in 2017. The treatment wasn't available in the United States, and she'd brought her daughter to live with her during the extended stays. That's how she met your wife. They were both patients in the same oncology ward. Richard sank into a chair, his entire worldview realigning. So Lynn and Sarah weren't just friends who met in a park. They were both fighting cancer at the same time. "More than that, sir. According to the hospital records, your wife was part of a support group for patients with young children. Sarah joined that group, and they became incredibly close because they both understood the pain of facing death while trying to raise daughters. Emma spent countless hours at the hospital during her mother's treatments, and your wife apparently became like a grandmother to her. The truth hit Richard like a tsunami. Emma hadn't just known about Lynn through her mother's stories. She'd actually known Lynn personally. She'd spent time with his wife, probably sat on her lap, learned Mandarin directly from the woman who'd once sung lullabies to his own daughter. "Dr. Mitchell, there's one more thing I need to know. Do you have any record of what happened to the experimental treatment? Did it work for either of them?" There was a long pause before Dr. Mitchell answered. "Mr. Chen, I'm afraid your wife's cancer was too advanced for the treatment to help. But Sarah Williams, her cancer went into complete remission after the experimental therapy. She lived for almost 2 additional years after returning to the United States." Richard's blood ran cold. "Then why did she die?" "Emma told me her mother died of cancer. According to the records I found, Sarah Williams died in a car accident in Chicago in late 2020. The same week, coincidentally, that the experimental cancer treatment she'd received was approved for use in the United States." The phone slipped from Richard's numb fingers as the full horror of the truth crashed over him. Sarah hadn't died of cancer. She'd beaten it, thanks to the treatment she'd received while bonding with Lynn. She'd survived the disease that killed his wife, only to die in the same type of accident that had claimed his daughter. Emma had lost her mother to the same random, senseless tragedy that had destroyed his family. They weren't just connected by friendship between their mothers. They were bound by identical grief, identical losses, identical wounds that only they could truly understand. But there was more. If Emma had spent months in Beijing during her mother's treatment, if she'd known Lynn personally, then her perfect Mandarin and wise insights weren't just the result of language lessons. She'd learned them directly from the woman who'd become her surrogate grandmother, who'd poured love and wisdom into this little girl during her own final months of life. Emma wasn't just carrying forward Lynn's teachings through stories. She was carrying forward Lynn's actual love, her actual presence, her actual spirit. She was the living bridge between his old family and his new one, the miracle that proved love really could transcend death. Richard picked up his phone with shaking hands and dialed Emma's number, knowing that when he saw her tonight, he'd be looking into the eyes of the child his wife had personally blessed and loved during her final months of life. The connection wasn't just spiritual, it was real, tangible, and absolutely impossible to deny. Richard arrived at Morrison Industries that evening to find Emma and Tom packing up their temporary living arrangement in the break room. The sight of their few possessions being loaded into worn boxes should have been heartbreaking, but Emma was humming happily while she wrapped her art supplies in newspaper. "We're moving to a real apartment tomorrow," Emma announced when she saw Richard. "Daddy found a place near my new school, and it has a window where I can watch birds in the morning." Tom looked up from folding Emma's clothes, his face a mixture of gratitude and lingering disbelief. "Mr. Chen, I still can't quite believe all this is real. After 3 years of struggling, to suddenly have hope again, it feels like a dream." Richard knelt down beside Emma, who was carefully packing her mother's journal in a special box. "Emma, I need to tell you something important. I spoke with people in Beijing today, and I learned that you actually knew my wife Lynn personally. You spent time with her in the hospital when your mother was receiving treatment." Emma's face lit up with recognition. "Oh, yes, Grandma Lynn. She taught me how to fold paper cranes and sang the most beautiful songs. I remember her hands were always so warm, even when she was sad." The casual way Emma referred to Lynn as Grandma nearly broke Richard's composure. "Do you remember much about that time?" "I remember she made Mama smile, even when the medicine made her feel sick," Emma said thoughtfully. "And she told me that someday I would meet her family, and that I should take very good care of them, because family is the most precious treasure in the whole world." Tom stopped folding clothes, staring at his daughter with amazement. "Emma, you never told me you remembered the woman who helped Mama in Beijing." Emma shrugged with her characteristic wisdom. "You seemed too sad to talk about Beijing, so I kept it private. But Grandma Lynn told me that secrets shared with love stop being secrets and become gifts." Richard's phone buzzed with another urgent message from his board. The deadline was approaching. He had 6 hours to decide between returning to Shanghai or losing his company. But as he watched Emma wrap her stuffed rabbit in one of her drawings, he realized the choice had already been made. "Tom, there's something else I need to tell you both," Richard said quietly. "I'm about to lose my company because I've chosen to be here with you instead of managing business in China. In a few hours, I might go from being a billionaire CEO to just another wealthy retiree with no job and no purpose." Tom's face paled. "Mr. Chen, you can't sacrifice your life's work for us. That's too much. We'll be fine with what you've already given us." "No," Richard interrupted gently. "You don't understand. This isn't a sacrifice. This is a homecoming." Emma climbed into his lap, her small arms wrapping around his neck. "Are you scared about losing your company?" "A little," Richard admitted. "But I'm more scared of losing this, losing you, losing the feeling of being part of a family again." "Then don't lose us," Emma said simply. "Mama Sarah always said that when you find your real treasure, you hold on to it with both hands and never let go." Richard looked at Tom, who was watching their interaction with tears in his eyes. "Tom, I want to ask you something, and I need you to know there's no pressure in this question. Would you and Emma consider letting me be part of your family, not as a benefactor or a family friend, but as someone who loves you both and wants to share the journey ahead?" Tom wiped his eyes, overwhelmed by emotion. "Richard, you've already given us more than we ever dreamed possible. But if you're asking whether we'd want you in our lives, not because of your money, but because of who you are, then yes. Emma's been missing a grandfather, And I've been missing a father figure more than I'd like to admit. Emma squeezed Richard tighter. So we're really going to be a family, even if the mean people take away your company. Especially then, Richard said, feeling 15 years of frozen grief finally begin to thaw completely. Because I've learned that the only wealth that really matters is love, and I'm richer than I've ever been right here in this moment. No, as midnight approached and Richard's phone buzzed with the final ultimatum from his board, he powered it off without reading the message. He'd made his choice, and for the first time since losing Lynn and Lily, he felt completely at peace. The little girl in his arms was Lynn's final gift to him, not just a connection to his past, but a bridge to a future filled with love, laughter, and the kind of wealth that could never be measured in dollars or stock options. Tomorrow, he would officially lose his company. But tonight, he'd found his family, and that made him the richest man in the world. 6 months later, Richard Chen stood in the kitchen of a modest 3-bedroom house in Evanston, flipping pancakes while Emma set the table with the careful precision of someone who took her responsibilities seriously. The morning sunlight streamed through windows that Emma had decorated with paper cranes, a skill Lynn had taught her during those precious months in Beijing. The official loss of his company had made international headlines. Billionaire CEO chooses love over fortune had been the Wall Street Journal's headline, though they'd gotten the story completely wrong. Richard hadn't lost anything. He'd finally found everything that truly mattered. "Daddy Richard, you're burning the pancakes again," Emma observed, with the gentle patience of someone who'd appointed herself the family's cooking supervisor. Richard laughed, a sound that had become natural again after years of silence. "Sorry, little chef. I was thinking about how different life looks from this kitchen." Tom appeared in the doorway, dressed for his new job at Northwestern University's Aerospace Engineering Department, a position Richard had helped him secure through his remaining business connections. The transformation in Tom over the past 6 months had been remarkable. The broken man who'd been cleaning office buildings had rediscovered his passion for reaching toward the stars. "Any regrets?" Tom asked quietly, a question he'd posed several times over the months as Richard adjusted to life without corporate power. "Only one," Richard replied honestly. "I regret that it took me 15 years to understand what Lynn was trying to teach me. That love is the only investment that pays dividends forever." Emma finished arranging the napkins and climbed onto her chair, which Richard had fitted with a special cushion so she could reach the table properly. "Grandma Lynn visited my dreams again last night," she announced casually, as if discussing the weather. Both men had learned to take Emma's dream visits seriously. Her previous visits from Lynn had provided guidance during Richard's difficult transition away from corporate life and had even helped Tom overcome his fear of returning to engineering. "What did she say this time?" Richard asked, setting a plate of perfectly golden pancakes in front of her. Emma's eyes sparkled with excitement. "She said to check the box under her hospital bed, the one with the red ribbon that no one ever found." Richard's fork froze halfway to his mouth. He'd kept Lynn's hospital room exactly as it was for 2 years after her death, unable to face sorting through her belongings. When he'd finally cleared it out, he'd been methodical but emotionally numb, possibly missing important items. "Emma, sweetheart, there's no way you could know about any box. You were only 3 when Lynn died, and she showed me where she hid it," Emma interrupted with absolute certainty. "She said it was time for you to have your final present from her and Lily." The mention of his daughter's name in connection with a hidden gift made Richard's heart race. After breakfast, he made a call to his former housekeeper in Shanghai, asking her to search the one place he'd never looked, under the specially designed hospital bed he'd had installed in Lynn's room during her final months. 3 hours later, his phone rang. "Mr. Chen, Mrs. Wang's voice trembled with emotion. "I found it." A small wooden box, wrapped with a red silk ribbon, exactly where the little girl said it would be. "Should I open it?" "Yes," Richard whispered, putting the call on speaker so Tom and Emma could hear. The sound of unwrapping filled the kitchen, followed by Mrs. Wang's gasp. "Mr. Chen, there are letters here, many letters, and a small jewelry box. The first letter is addressed to my beloved Richard, for the day you find your way back to love." Richard's hands shook as Mrs. Wang read Lin's final message aloud. "My darling husband, if you are hearing this, then Emma has found you, just as I prayed she would. I knew from the moment I met Sarah's precious daughter that she would be the bridge between our old life and your new beginning. Emma carries within her the love of both our families, and she will teach you what I could not. That healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means growing large enough to hold both grief and joy simultaneously. Man Mrs. Dudi." Wang's voice cracked as she continued. "The little jewelry box contains Lily's baby ring, the one she was wearing when she was born. Sarah promised me that if Emma ever met you, she would give it to her new little sister. Emma is the daughter we couldn't save, brought to you by the daughter we lost. Love finds a way, my darling. It always finds a way." Emma climbed into Richard's lap as tears streamed down his face. "Grandma Lin said Lily picked me especially to take care of you. She said I have her smile and your stubborn heart, and that makes me perfect for the job." Tom wrapped his arms around both of them, creating a circle of love that somehow felt complete despite being built from broken pieces. "So we're not just a family of convenience," he whispered. "We're a family of destiny." Richard looked around the modest kitchen that had become more precious to him than any boardroom, at the little girl who'd healed his heart with wisdom beyond her years, and at the man who'd become the brother he'd never had. His billion-dollar empire was gone, but his real fortune sat right here at this breakfast table. "Emma," Richard said softly, "do you know what the most amazing part of this story is?" She tilted her head with curious eyes. "What?" "Lily and your mama worked together from heaven to bring us all home to each other. That means love really is stronger than death, and family really can be chosen with the heart instead of born with blood." Emma smiled with the radiant joy of someone who'd always known that love was the most powerful force in the universe. "I told you love finds a way, Daddy Richard. It always finds a way." As morning sunlight filled their kitchen, and Emma chattered about her plans to teach her new baby sister origami when the adoption papers were finalized, Richard realized that losing everything had actually been the path to finding everything. Lin's final gift wasn't hidden in a box under a hospital bed. It was sitting right here in his arms, teaching him that the richest man in the world is simply the one who has learned to love without counting the cost.